Millions have read her words of hope, but the place her story ended was a world beyond anything her diary could ever describe. For 2 years, a small, hidden annex was her entire universe. In its quiet confines, she poured her dreams, her fears, and her sharp, brilliant observations onto the pages of a checkered notebook she lovingly called Kitty. She wrote about love, nature, her ambition to become a great writer, and her unshakable belief that, in spite of everything, people were really good at heart. But then, the diary stops. Her voice, so full of life, just falls silent. And in that silence, a new chapter begins. A story of unimaginable suffering that her own words never had the chance to capture. The story of what happened after the last page is a descent into a hell she couldn't have conceived, a reality far more terrible than her worst fears in the annex. This is the story of Anne Frank's final 7 months. It was Tuesday, August 1st, 1944, their 756th day in hiding. For over 2 years, the secret annex at Prinsengracht 263 had been a fragile sanctuary for 8 people. Tensions were a constant, humming wire. The war raged on outside. Its tremors felt even through the thick walls and blacked-out windows. Allied bombs sometimes fell nearby, shaking the building and their nerves. Food was scarce, the days were monotonous, and the fear of discovery was a ninth, silent resident that never, ever slept. Yet, on that Tuesday, 15-year-old Anne Frank sat down to write. She was no longer the girl who had walked into the annex at 13. She was a young woman, grappling with the complexities of her own soul. Her final entry isn't about the war, or the hunger, or the fear. It's about her. She wrote to Kitty about being a bundle of contradictions. She described having 2 Annes. There was, in number 1, the exuberant cheerfulness, the flippancy, the joy in life. This was the Anne who was quick with a joke, the know-it-all, the girl who could laugh things off. But then there was, in number 2, the purer, deeper, and finer Anne. This was the quiet, introspective girl who held her ideals close, who felt everything with a painful intensity. I'm awfully scared that everyone who knows me as I always am will discover that I have another side, she confessed. I'm afraid they'll laugh at me, think I'm ridiculous and sentimental, not take me seriously. She felt this deeper self was just too frail for the world, and so she kept it hidden. I end up turning my heart inside out, she wrote, the bad part on the outside and the good part on the inside. Her last written words are a plea, a wish for a future she was starting to doubt she'd ever see. I keep on trying to find a way of becoming what I would so like to be, and what I could be if there weren't any other people in the world. It's a haunting sentence, filled with the impossible longing of a teenager who just wants to be understood, trapped not only by walls, but by the watchful eyes of others and the crushing weight of her circumstances. She signs off as she always does. Yours, and M. Frank. She would never write in her diary again. 3 days later, her world, and the fragile hope she clung to, was irrevocably shattered. The morning of August 4th, 1944, started like any other. It was a warm, sunny day in Amsterdam. Inside the annex, it was day 761. Upstairs, Otto Frank was helping Peter Van Pels with his schoolwork, trying to maintain some sliver of normalcy, a routine to hold back the tide of anxiety. For over 2 years, the routine had held. For over 2 years, they had lived on a knife's edge, praying each day wouldn't be their last. Then, between 10:30 and 11 o'clock in the morning, the moment they had dreaded for 25 long months finally came. A commotion downstairs. The sound of heavy footsteps. Otto recalled it later. Suddenly someone came running up the stairs, and then the door opened, and there was a man right in front of us with a pistol in his hand. The man was SS Oberscharfer Karl Silberbauer, an Austrian Nazi, and he wasn't alone. He was with several Dutch security police, and they knew exactly where they were going. They stormed past the offices, up the stairs, and straight to the revolving bookcase. The secret was out. The 8 people in hiding, Otto, Edith, Margot, and Anne Frank, Hermann, Auguste, and Peter Van Pels, and Fritz Pfeffer, were herded downstairs at gunpoint. They were in shock, paralyzed by the sudden, violent end to their sealed-off world. Silberbauer demanded their valuables. Otto handed over a briefcase. In his rush to empty it for cash and jewels, Silberbauer tipped it upside down, scattering papers all over the wooden floor. Among them were the loose pages of Anne's diary. In that single moment of terror and greed, the words that would give a voice to millions of victims lay abandoned as their author was marched toward her fate. The raid took over 2 hours. The 8 residents of the annex, along with 2 of their courageous helpers, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman, were arrested. They were loaded into a covered truck and driven away, leaving the annex eerily silent. The clock on the Westertoren church, which Anne had mentioned so often in her diary, kept chiming the quarter hours. But for the girl who had listened to it for 2 years, time had just run out. Later that day, Miep Gies, another helper who had risked her life, crept back into the annex. With a heavy heart, she gathered and scattered writings, hoping to save them for her return. She didn't read them. She just tucked them away in her desk drawer to wait for the war to end. So, who made the call? Who betrayed them? It's the most agonizing question in this story, and it remains a painful, unsolved mystery. For decades, suspicion fell on a warehouse worker named Willem van Meren. Even Otto Frank suspected him. But multiple investigations never found conclusive proof. Other names have surfaced. Lena Hartog, the wife of another employee, Tani Ehlers, a Dutch Nazi sympathizer, even Nelly Vosquigel, the sister of one of their helpers. A 2016 study by the Anne Frank House suggested a different, more mundane, and perhaps even more tragic possibility. There was no betrayal. The police might have been investigating illegal work and ration card fraud at the address and just stumbled upon the hiding place by chance. Then, in 2022, a cold case investigation pointed the finger at a prominent Jewish notary, Arnold van den Berg, theorizing he gave up addresses to save his own family. But this theory has been met with significant doubt from historians, who point to a lack of solid evidence. The truth is, we may never know for sure. Whether it was an act of malice, desperation, or just random, cruel chance, the result was the same. The shield of the secret annex was broken, and its 8 residents were cast into the monstrous machinery of the Holocaust. Their first stop was the Gestapo headquarters in Amsterdam. After a night of interrogation in an overcrowded prison, they were moved to Camp Westerbork, a Nazi transit camp in the northeast of the Netherlands. Over 100,000 Dutch and German Jews had already passed through its gates on their way to the death camps in Poland. Westerbork was a kind of purgatory. It wasn't an extermination camp, but a place of waiting, of dread, and of false hope. It had barracks, a hospital, even a school. But every Tuesday, a train would arrive. Its departure meant deportation, a one-way ticket to the east, to a place people only spoke of in terrified whispers, Auschwitz. For the 8 from the annex, things were different. They were criminal cases because they'd been caught in hiding. This landed them in the punishment barracks, where conditions were harsher. They were forced to dismantle old airplane batteries, a dirty, grueling job. Yet, for one brief month, they were together. Survivor testimony recalls seeing Anne there, still talkative and curious, though undoubtedly terrified. For the first time in 2 years, she was under an open sky, but it was the sky of a prison. Any feeling of freedom was an illusion. They had arrived at the worst possible time. The Allies were advancing, and the Nazis were speeding up the liquidation of the remaining Jews in Western Europe. On September 3, 1944, just a month after their arrest, the final transport was scheduled to leave Westerbork for Auschwitz. That morning, 1,019 men, women, and children were herded onto the tracks. Among them were the 8 from the secret annex. The journey that followed was the true beginning of the horror, a kind of suffering Anne's diary could never have prepared her for. They were forced into cattle cars, with 80 people crammed into a space that had no seats, no windows, and barely enough air to breathe. A single bucket in the corner served as a toilet. The doors were bolted from the outside, plunging them into a claustrophobic, terrifying darkness. For 3 days and 3 nights, the train rumbled eastward. The trip was an exercise in pure degradation. The air grew foul. The heat was suffocating. People got sick. The weak fainted. There was no food and no water, only the rhythmic, metallic clatter of the wheels on the track, carrying them deeper and deeper into the unknown. This was a world away from the intellectual and emotional struggles of the annex. This was a physical assault on human dignity, a systematic stripping away of everything that makes a person human. It was no longer about being quiet. It was about fighting for a breath of air, for the will to simply stay standing. In that stinking, rolling darkness, and Frank crossed a threshold. The girl who wrote about the beauty of chestnut trees and the goodness of people was now trapped in a wooden box, hurtling towards a place built for the sole purpose of extinguishing life. The hope she had so carefully nurtured was being starved, suffocated, and crushed, mile by agonizing mile. On the night of September 5th, after 3 torturous days, the train finally shuddered to a halt. The heavy bolts were thrown back, and the doors slid open to reveal sheer chaos. Blinding floodlights cut through the darkness. Men in striped uniforms ran alongside the tracks. SS guards barked orders in German, their voices amplified by the frantic barking of dogs. This was the arrival platform at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most lethal of all the Nazi death camps. Immediately, the selection began. Men were violently torn from women and children. In the pandemonium, Anne, Margot, and their mother Edith were shoved one way, while Otto Frank was forced the other. It was the last time they would ever see him. Amid the screaming and confusion, the girls caught one last, fleeting glimpse of their father, a bewildered figure being swept away in a sea of men. Of the 1,019 people on their transport, 549 were sent directly to the gas chambers. This included all children under 15, and had turned 15 just 3 months earlier. That small accident of birth saved her from immediate death, but condemned her to a slower, more agonizing one. Then began the process of total dehumanization. Survivor Jenny Brandis Brillislichper, who was with and until the end, described it. We were stripped in an icy room. 5 women under 1 trickle of water. No towels. Tattooed. Shaved. We were totally confused. Their heads were shaved. Their clothes were taken. They were given thin, striped prison rags to wear. Their identities were erased, replaced by the crushing anonymity of the camp. And, who was so aware of her own unique spirit, was now just another prisoner, another shaved head in a crowd of thousands. They were assigned to Block 29 in the women's camp at Birkenau. Life became a relentless cycle of hunger, disease, and fear. The daily soup was a watery, foul-tasting liquid. The bread was hard and often moldy. The wooden bunks were infested with lice, and the women were packed in so tightly they could barely move. The air was thick with the constant, sickeningly sweet smell of burning flesh from the crematoria, whose chimneys were a constant, horrifying fixture on the horizon. Death was everywhere. You'd wake up, and the person next to you might be gone. Selections were frequent and random. A single glance from an SS doctor like Joseph Mengele could be a death sentence. Edith Frank watched her daughters grow weaker by the day. She did everything she could to keep them alive, often saving her own meager rations of bread to pass to them through a fence when they were separated by illness. Witnesses remembered Anne, but she was changing. The vivacious girl was still there, sometimes telling stories to the other women. But she was quieter, more withdrawn. She quickly learned that most people were gassed on arrival and became convinced that her father, in his mid-50s and not especially strong, had been killed immediately. The hope that had been her shield was cracking under the immense weight of despair. In late October 1944, with the Soviet army advancing, the Nazis began to evacuate Auschwitz. Rumors of transports to other camps, away from the gas chambers, offered a spark of hope, and and Margot were selected for a transport. Their mother, Edith, was not. She was forced to stay behind. She would die of starvation and exhaustion in Auschwitz in early January 1945, all alone, thinking only of the daughters she had tried so desperately to save. For Anne and Margot, the journey out of Auschwitz wasn't an escape to freedom. It was a transfer from one circle of hell to another, one that, in its own way, would be even worse. Their final destination was a place called Bergen Belsen. When Anne and Margot arrived at Bergen Belsen in late October or early November 1944, they stepped into a scene of utter catastrophe. Unlike Auschwitz, Bergen Belsen wasn't designed as an extermination camp. It became a death camp through deliberate, criminal neglect. It was now a collection point for thousands of prisoners evacuated from other camps, and it was horrifically overcrowded, a fetid, sprawling morass of mud and human misery. By early 1945, the conditions had completely collapsed. There was almost no food. The water was contaminated. Sanitation was non-existent. The flimsy barracks offered little protection from the brutal German winter. Typhus, spread by lice, swept through the camp like wildfire, joined by dysentery and tuberculosis. In March 1945 alone, over 18,000 people died. The camp was filled with thousands of unburied corpses lying on the frozen ground. This wasn't a place of organized killing, it was a place of mass dying. It was here, in this abyss, that Anne Frank would live out her final weeks. And it's here that we have the most harrowing accounts of what became of her, primarily from two women who knew her childhood friend, Hannah Goslar, and a resistance nurse named Jannie Brandis-Brillis-Lichber. Hannah, who Anne knew as Hanley, was in a separate, slightly better part of the camp. One night, in early 1945, she heard a rumor that a Dutch friend was in the section next to hers, separated by a high, thick fence stuffed with straw. She went to the fence and called out. A woman's voice answered. It was Auguste Van Pels. She said she would bring Anne. A few minutes later, Hannah heard a faint voice in the darkness. It was Anne. Hannah couldn't see her through the straw and the gloom, but the voice was enough to break her heart. It wasn't the same and that I had known, Hannah recalled. She was a broken girl. She began to cry right away and was shivering, starving, and consumed by despair. I don't have any parents anymore, she wailed, believing both her mother and father were dead. We don't have anything at all to eat here. We are cold. We don't have any clothes, she cried. Hannah, who had a small Red Cross package, promised to bring her something. A few nights later, she returned and threw a small bundle over the fence. But in the darkness, another hungry woman snatched it and was left with nothing. Hannah had to calm her friends sobbing and promised to try again. On her second attempt, she managed to get a small package with stockings and a piece of bread to Anne. It was the last time they ever spoke. The end at the fence was a ghost of her former self, a child stripped of her family, her health, her clothes, and most tragically, her hope. That famous line from her diary, "I still believe that people are really good at heart," felt like a relic from another lifetime. Hannah later said that if Anne had survived, she didn't believe her friend would have stood by that statement anymore. Jannie Brandis-Brillis-Lichber witnessed the sisters' final decline. She and her own sister did what they could, trying to find them scraps of food. But by then, both Anne and Margot had contracted typhus. They were skeletal, racked with fever and hallucinations. The girls Frank were already in such a weak state. It looked terrible, Jannie testified. Margot, older and always quieter, was the first to die. Already critically ill, she fell from her wooden bunk onto the stone floor below. The shock was too much for her emaciated body. Her sister's death completely destroyed what little was left of Anne. Jannie described seeing her in those final days, a haunting, desolate figure. During the final days, I saw Anne standing there, wrapped in a blanket, with no tears left to cry. Well, we hadn't had tears for some time. A few days after Margot's death, Anne died too. She was 15 years old. Jannie and her sister took their frail bodies and buried them in one of the camp's mass graves. There was no funeral, no marker, no last words. Just an anonymous end in a sea of countless dead, a brilliant light extinguished in the mud and filth of Bergen Belsen. She died sometime in February or early March of 1945. British troops would liberate the camp on April 15th, just a few weeks after she was gone. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. As survivors began the long journey home, a father searched desperately for news of his children. Otto Frank was the only one of the 8 from the secret annex to survive. Liberated from Auschwitz by the Soviets, he made his way back to Amsterdam in June, moving in with Miep and Jan Gies, holding on to the fierce hope that his daughters might have somehow made it. He already knew his wife, Edith, had died in Auschwitz. For weeks, he waited, asking every survivor he met for news of Margot and Anne. Finally, in July, he met Jannie and Leandra Brandis-Brillis-Lichber. From them, he received the devastating, final confirmation. His daughters were gone. Only then, when all hope was lost, did Miep Gies finally give him what she had been saving. She opened her desk drawer and handed him the checkered diary and the loose papers she had rescued from the annex floor a year before. "Here," she said, "is the legacy of your daughter," and in the months that followed, Otto began to read. And through her words, his daughter came back to life. He met a side of her he had never fully known, her depth, her ambition, her brilliant, burgeoning talent. He learned of her dream to become a writer, and he learned of a specific wish she had expressed, a sentence that now read like a prophecy. I want to go on living even after my death." Otto Frank knew what he had to do. He dedicated the rest of his life to fulfilling that wish. In 1947, The Diary of a Young Girl was published. Today, millions have read her words. Her diary is a monumental testament to the power of hope and the resilience of the human spirit. But the story of that spirit doesn't end on the last page. The full truth has to include the 7 months that followed. It must include the cattle car, the selection platform, and the typhus-ridden barracks of Bergen Belsen. The diary gives us Anne's life. Her final days give us the unvarnished truth of her death and the deaths of 6 million others. To remember one without the other is to tell only half the story. And Frank's legacy is a dual one. It's the soaring hope of a girl who dreamed of a better world, and it's the devastating silence of a mass grave that stands as a warning of what happens when that hope is extinguished. To truly understand her story, we must be brave enough to look at both. To learn more about Anne Frank's life and to support the educational work that preserves her memory, please consider visiting the website of the Anne Frank House. Thank you for watching.